can direct your questions to Dr. Nicodemus. Thank you. So for our main lecture for tonight, entitled Chronic Interstitial Nephritis in Agricultural Communities, a New Epidemic, Cnap, as they call it, is a disease that affects young agricultural workers for low-income tropical countries. Initially, heat stress has been proposed as the mechanism or a role in this particular findings or Cnap. However, later studies have suggested that Cnap is a toxin-induced nephropathy that affects calcineurin signaling pathway. And to enlighten us and untangle the mechanisms behind its pathology, let me welcome Professor Mac DeBro, who first described specific lesions in the kidneys. Professor Mac DeBro is an emeritus professor of medicine at the University of Antwerp. He formerly had the Department of Nephrology, Hypertension, and Renal Transplantation in the same university. He has been the director of the Renal Research Unit of the Faculty of Medicine, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine. He is a member of the Royal Academy of Medicine of Belgium, Associate Editor of Kidney International, member of the Africa Commission of ISN, Scientific Advisor of the Physiopathology Research Unit, University of Antwerp. Mac DeBro had initiated a screening and preventive treatment program in the Kingdom of Morocco, which started in November of 2009. Professor's CME interest includes nephrotoxicity, experimental, clinical, and acute kidney injury, calcium phosphate metabolism, clinical, experimental, vascular calcifications, and the use of immunosuppressive drugs in renal transplantation programs in developing countries. So everyone, let's all welcome Professor Mac DeBro to enlighten us on this topic.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, thank you, Madam, for this nice introduction. And I'm very happy that I can communicate finally with people from Philippines, because I tried to come to your country, but this, as you know, was a special disease dominating the world currently, and I hope we will be end this very soon. So I will tell a brand new story on a brand new renal disease, which has been discovered by colleagues in Sri Lanka and El Salvador, and which was related, as you said, due to the working in difficult conditions where sugar cane and tea plantations, and so that the people are suffering from heat stress and maybe are indeed developing a renal failure. I try to advance my slides, but it's difficult. I will do it here probably. Oh, nice. So here, I've shown you the two countries where the disease was found, being Sri Lanka and Nicaragua and El Salvador, something like 20 years ago. So at that time, the most people were thinking that was due to heat stress. But let's look first to the clinical presentation. The clinical presentation is a little bit difficult in the sense that most of the criteria are negative. Let's start with the only which is positive, showing that indeed the patients having that disease have already some decrease of renal function and have most of the time when they present themselves to the doctor, CKD 3A, 3B, even 4. But proteinuria is almost absent, very exceptional. And if it is present, most of the time it's tubular proteinuria, meaning that you don't see a lot of albumin and immunoglobulins, etc., etc. They all work and live in agricultural communities, and most of the time in endemic areas, because where the disease is very prevalent. And there is no other known cause of CKD in these patients. They have no hypertension, and they will tell you later on why. There's no glomerulopathy. So this is a disease with a rather quick progression to end-stage renal failure between 5 and 10 years, and presenting himself with a number of negative criteria which make the diagnosis not easy. the two main diagnoses, the two main etiologies of that diagnosis are heat stress, as shown in the top of this slide, and other people like myself, more and more begin to start, and I started already from the beginning. I was not believing that this could be heat stress alone, that pesticides maybe could be a reason of an etiology of that disease. So I will give you my arguments, because we do not believe when we started these studies 4 years ago in 2016 with people from Sri Lanka and Salvador and France and many other countries in the world. The first reason simply is that in Sri Lanka, the paddy field culture was so old as the country, 3,000 years long. Not a single case have been registered until the 90s. And suddenly, in 92, 93, 94, and it exploded in 95 and 6, hundreds of cases of patients, farmers, presenting them to outpatient clinics with advanced renal failure. And this was related with the introduction of pesticides and mechanization of the agriculture habits of that country. So that's a first simple epidemiological argument. Another argument, which I think is more stronger, and I like very much. Here you see on the left, on the right side, one of my peers when I was young, Che Guevara. He was a minister of health in Cuba. And Cuba is not far away from El Salvador. And in El Salvador, the disease is very prevalent among the farmers. And in Cuba, there is no disease of chronic interstitial nephritis. The culture is exactly the same. The farmers of El Salvador and the farmers from Cuba, they raise sugarcane as main crop. The temperature is equal, the rainfall is equal, the age above sea level is equal. So everything is comparable, except one thing. In Cuba, they were never able to use American imported pesticides because of the embargo. It's one of the few advantages they have had of this embargo, that they have never had this renal disease and still don't have. So this is a very strong argument, but probably the pesticides or something to do with agrochemicals could play a very important role in that.
Professor.
The third argument is here. You see a part of Sri Lanka. And you see the blue background, and you see the green dots and the red spots. The green dots are all paddy fields. And you see some paddy fields have no patients, have no disease. And some are very high prevalence of disease, the red dots. In these red dots, we could observe that the wells the patients and the farmers use for drinking water are very low, with low flow, almost dried wells, stagnated water. And with the villages without the disease have using wells with a very high flow, which is probably washing out much quickly whatever contamination. And finally, as a last argument, I've shown you this recent publication of Pedro Ordóñez, showing, and let's look to the right side of this slide, that he proved that in infants between 10 and 20 years of age, you could observe this enormous increase of end-stage renal failure in the children of Nicaragua and El Salvador, and not in the children of the United States, Cuba, and Costa Rica, where the disease is not present. So meaning that even not working in the fields, because children do not work in the fields, not directly exposed to agrochemicals, probably the water they use for drinking, washing, etc., is heavily contaminated with agrochemicals. So we started from scratch. We have investigated in 4 different countries, and we are now doing that in many other countries. We started by doing renal biopsies in patients with clinically proven Cnap, chronic interstitial nephritis in agricultural communities. So I will not repeat the criteria, but I have summarized them a few minutes ago for patients working on the fields and exposed to pesticides. So by doing that, and by applying a silver stain, joint state to these biopsies, we show in the proximal tubular cells, you see this enormous number of enlarged granules in the cell. At that time, we are not aware what it was, absolutely not. But it was remarkable to find in the more than 55 cases we had analyzed at that time, that's in 2017 and 2018, this presence in all the patients who had that disease clinically proven, and with the biopsy which was not too far advanced concerning fibrosis, that you could identify the proximal tubular cells. In the proximal tubular cells, there were granules deposited, not always in all the cells, but always in some cells, and otherwise in more, as shown in this slide. This slide shows you even more that if you look to these granules in the patients, you do higher magnifications, you can see that the granules can be very high, very big, almost 2 to 4 microns diameter, and they contain other dark structures. So this was a very peculiar appearance that we saw in all the cases, not very frequent, not so frequent as the smaller granules, but in all patients we could see such big granules which were stuffed with intragranular aggregates as shown in this. Sorry?
Can you present the slides in a slide view? Is it possible?
In what?
Slide view. Slide view. It's slide in the presenter form, yes.
Yeah, or the slide's not clear?
It's clear, but it's reflecting the presenter view. But anyway, let's continue.
That's terrible, but what can I do to improve that?
You can press the slide presenter view, the one below on the right side.
I don't see that.
That's okay.
Yes. Presentation. Okay, I will.
You can continue.
I'm very sorry for that.
Okay.
So I tried to show you here in this slide that these dots, that these granules in the proximal tubular cell are autofluorescent. Normally, the organelles in the normal biopsy of a human biopsy is not very fluorescent. It's exceptional, but this is very prominent. You can see that all this higher magnification, you can almost count the number of dots, or the number of granules, and all of them were autofluorescent. So then we looked where we found this, and we started from the beginning. Here is a picture of a glomerulus, and you see the start of the capsule of Bowman, and see the first cell, the first proximal tubular cells, as shown in this slide. Here you see that already in S1, part of the proximal tubular cell, you see these nice big granules intracellular. And when we went further on, we have developed over the years different markers for different segments of the proximal tubular cell, S1, S2, and S3, and we could show and prove that in all the segments of the proximal tubular cell, we can see these granules. We could not see them in the distal tubular cell, nor in the more distal part. In addition, this intracellular granules were associated with very pronounced atrophy. Some patients, and it starts, and at the beginning of the disease, there is less atrophy, but still one of the first signs you see in that disease is this granules in the proximal tubular cell. Now later on, you see the atrophy, the thick basement membrane, and the fibrosis, which is starting. But you also see, as shown here, that there is a lot of atrophy of the cell and shedding of material out of the proximal tubular cell into the lumen, which is showing that the cell is really suffering very heavily. As shown here in a more detail of a proximal tubular section, you see the enormous atrophy of the proximal tubular cells. They are barely the height of the nucleus, even sometimes smaller, and a lot of shedded material in the lumen of the cells. We also were surprised by the following. When we studied in biopsies the regeneration capacity of the proximal tubular cells. As you know, if you destroy, you impose a toxin or an ischemia, to the kidney, the proximal tubular cell is dying very quickly, or is suffering very much because it's a cell living at the edge of desaturation. Then you have this enormous regeneration capacity of the cell, proximal tubular cell. Well, this regeneration capacity has faded away. We could not see it. And as you see here, to show you that, you see this, the fluorescent cells, which is the proximal tubular cell, stuffed with the granules. And this proximal cell has no PCNA reaction, which is a marker of proliferation. On the other hand, the distal tubular cells have a very high proliferation, which is extremely unusual. And even if you look further, we saw in this distal tubular cells apoptosis, which is also the signature of a very proliferative segment of the kidney. So meaning that when you destroy the proximal tubular cell, as is happening in that disease, you find an hypertrophy and hyperplasia in the later nephron, in the distal nephron, really showing that this disease is a proximal tubular disease. We finally could show, and then we start with the identification, when we did the staining of the kidney, the biopsies for cathepsin B, which is an enzyme, a lysosomal enzyme, as shown here in this slide on the left side. The yellow dots are all positive dots of cathepsin B, and these yellow dots are exactly those silver-stained dark granules we found in the biopsies in all the patients, proving that these granules are big lysosomes in the kidney of patients with that disease. We even went further. We did the same by confocal microscopy, and we used the fluorescent biopsies, and we looked to the autofluorescence, and when we incubated the cells with cathepsin B or LAMP1, which is an enzyme, which is a protein at the borderline of the membrane of the lysosome, you can see that there is, when you do confocal microscopy, the yellow color becomes red in the membrane here, clearly showing that these are lysosomes. In other words, the granules we have observed, the caricatural increase are big lysosomes in the cells of proximity of the patients with that disease. Let's go to electron microscopy, and you will see immediately the abnormality of the lysosomes, of the granules. You will see immediately, even if this also are lysosomes. So you see here a cell, which is still rather normal, because the cell has still a breastbone. So these proximal tubular cells are not dead, but you're suffering. And you're stuffed with this material. All these big lysosomes, sometimes more than 1.5 to 2 micron diameter, they have an abnormal morphology. They are dysmorphic. And inside of the cells, you have a rather monotonous background, but there is full of granules, aggregates inside of these granules. And that's the hallmark of the morphological signature of that lesion in the electron microscope. You see another example of patients with this on top, 2 patients with enormous lysosomes. And this starts, and either in the back and the lower part of the slide, you see probably the stage just before this big lysosome. You see a lot of smaller ones all together, coming all together, and maybe generating these much bigger ones in function of time. We have proven this lesion is not autophagosomes. They are not autophagosomes, because autophagosomes, they have a complete different intracellular, intra-organelle structure. We never saw any signature that these lesions in the patients with Cena have this aggregates. They don't have a membrane. And if you're an autophagosome, you should have a membrane in your granules. This is not the case. These lesions are not myeloid bodies. You can see myeloid bodies as shown in this slide. In the biopsy of patients who have received aminoglycosides, all of them develop myeloid bodies in the lysosomes. Well, these myeloid bodies which have been described by many people, are absolutely not what we saw in the lysosomes of the patient with Cena. This is not lipofuscin. But lipofuscin is something completely different. It is containing lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates, which meaning everything. But if you look to the morphology of that and you compare that with the morphology we have found in our lesions, it's completely different. So to summarize, we have discovered in all the patients with that disease that in the proximal tubular cell, something is going wrong. That one of the first things you see is this lysosomal lesion. And later on top of that, atrophy, senescence, shedding, starting, and fibrosis. As you all know, the proximal tubular cell is a cell who has the highest capacity to develop fibrosis in the kidney. Even in diabetes, as said by the previous speaker, who focused on the glomerulus, but nowadays in modern physiopathology of diabetes, the proximal tubular cell is becoming more and more central in the pathology. So in that disease, we have something wrong with the lysosomes, which are a very early lesion, and later on with atrophy and tubular. So we had to prove still that in the electron microscope that these are lysosomes. And as I said already, we know that the lysosomes of our patients are herophilic. They have precipitation of silver in the silver stain. So what we did is did X-ray fluorescence. We bombarded a biopsy of the patient with an X-ray, and we identified what kind of metals are found in the nucleus, in the lysosomes, in the membrane, in the endosomes, etc. And we could clearly show that in the patients, we found that in the basement membrane, there is a lot of silver, because we know that the silver stain is staining the basement membrane, but also in all the lysosomes and all the organelles, this dystrophic lysosomes, we found the staining for silver, clearly showing that this is indeed the same lysosome like we see in the light microscopy. So we were sure of the diagnosis in the light microscope and in the electron microscope. This is the lesion which is prototype arterial, which is prototype for that disease. We did a lot of type of nephropathies to see what is the sensitivity and the specificity of that lesion, and we can come out with the conclusion that this lesion is very sensitive. And we found it now in other countries. Most of the time, most of the publications on that disease come from developing countries like Sri Lanka and Salvador, but we found it in France. And what we did, we went to the vineyards, because the farmers raising wine, they use a lot of pesticides. The highest amount of pesticides, as he is shown here, is the map of France. And you see the dark zones are the vineyards regions, Bordeaux, Bourgogne, the Loire. And we went to the vineyards and we looked to patients coming to consultation by the nephrologist, and we found several cases of farmers using these pesticides in the vineyards, and they developed exactly the same lesion. The pathology was exactly the same on the light microscope and on the electron microscope. So that was an interesting observation, because this was meaning that a country which has not heat stress, France, the last 2 years, maybe the climate is a bit going up in the temperature, but normally the farmers working in the vineyards are protected very well and against the heat, if there is some heat. But this is not a country where you can compare to the Sri Lanka of the El Salvador. So the finding of this disease in people in France working exposed to pesticides was an important step forward in our understanding. We were extremely surprised at the beginning, but after some time rather happy, what we found that all the patients receiving calcineurin inhibitors, cyclosporin and tacrolimus, which are the two main drugs in transplantation, had exactly the same lesion. As you see here, you see the light microscopy on the left side of the image, the Jones staining, and you see again all these nice black dots. And if you go to the electron microscope, you see the dysmorphic lysosomes stuffed with the organelles exactly the same as we observed in our patients with Cena. Again, the same in our 2 other cases of patients with cyclosporin and tacrolimus. So the calcineurin, and these are calcineurin inhibitors. And calcineurin inhibition in transplantation means it's the basis for immunosuppression. And this is going the following way. Here is the membrane of the cell. There is a signal coming in. Calcineurin is activated. And calcineurin is a dephosphorylator. It dephosphorylates NFAT, nuclear factor for activated T cells. And this factor moves to the nucleus and starts reading out several molecules in order to do an anti-rejection, to do an effect to destroy the strange element which is coming to the cell. So it is the defense mechanism. And what we do in transplantation, we stop that in order to immunosuppress and stop rejection, because we don't want rejection. So we give calcineurin. Unfortunately, every calcineurin inhibitor is nephrotoxic, and every nephrotoxic calcineurin is immunosuppressive. So one may conclude that this lesion we found in the patients with transplantation is due to calcineurin inhibition, and that is the reason why patients with Cena disease have the same lesion, because pesticides are calcineurin inhibitors. So we found a common mechanism between the renal lesion in the transplantation and the renal lesion in the Cena patients in El Salvador, France, and many other countries. We also found in the meantime, and it's not surprising, that other types of nephrotoxicity like lomustine, clomiphene, and lithium have exactly also the same lesion. And we found literature, we looked at the literature, and these drugs have also a calcineurin inhibition effect described in their pharmacology. We did, and then we looked in the transplantation to see if this lesion was early and if this lesion was progressive. So we did protocol biopsies of cadaver kidneys at implantation and living donors at implantation as starting point, and then protocol biopsies at 6 months, 12 months, and by indication. And you can nicely see that at the start, there is only a very few patients who have some of these lysosomal lesions, which could be related to earlier exposure to whatever toxic effect of the kidney. But once they are on immunosuppression with the cyclosporin of tacrolimus, you see the dramatic increase up to 67, and 76% of the patients have these lesions in their biopsies after some time. So we have developed a diagnostic test which is informative, not a final diagnosis, but already indicative. When you find in the Jones staining, in the light microscope, you find these big dots present in the proximal tubular cells. And that you have to confirm by doing electron microscopy. And if you find these dystrophic lysosomes bigger than 1.2 micron, you can be sure that this patient has Cena disease. The last thing I want to tell in a very short time, we did an experiment in order to convince ourselves what is the role of dehydration. It could be that the dehydration is also inducing those lesions in the proximal tubular cell. And we did for that experiment, a controlled experiment. We give rats dehydration. We have given the rats cyclosporin because we knew that this is inducing that lesion in the lysosomes. And we used, of course, control rats. You see here that the urine of the rats, dehydrated rats, show clearly hyperosmolality. And you see already, when you look at this light microscope, that the control, the dehydrated and the cyclosporin is dramatically different. You see the high level of abnormal lysosomes in the light microscope of cyclosporin rats and almost nothing in the dehydrated rats. And we could confirm that by the higher magnification in the light microscope. You see already also the atrophy of the proximal tubular cells. So all the stigmata we have found in the patient with Cena are coming up in this cyclosporin. and not in the dehydrated blood. In addition, the cyclosporin shown this abnormal lysosome shown here in this slide, and many others we have investigated. So in other words, and when we did proteomics, and I will go very quickly over that because that's a lecture in itself, we compared the proteomics for the dehydration and cyclosporin. And we could see that there was a dramatic difference in the differentially expressed proteins first, that there was an enormous difference in the textus analysis, extracting semantic textual meaning from the different analysis. And you see that for the cyclosporin, you see oxidative stress, fatty acid metabolism, and failure being major pathways which are not present in dehydration. So we could show that this dehydration probably is not inducing those lesions. And before I may come to my conclusion, I just shown you a very recent meta-analysis done in a very serious way. The quality of this meta-analysis is very high. And they looked at all the papers published concerning agrochemicals and all the papers concerning heat stress. And the authors concluded that there was no consistent evidence from our systematic review to support the association between CKD and heat stress dehydration. On the other hand, they found consistent evidence of the adverse effect of agrochemicals on chronic kidney disease, and in some studies in association with end-stage failure. So in conclusion, I think we have found that in several countries, France, El Salvador, India, Sri Lanka, and now also in Morocco, and also in El Salvador, and in La Réunion, and also in Egypt, we have now found exactly the same disease, showing the same lesions in the proximal cells in already 7 countries. And we hope to go on and to be able to do that in the Philippines very soon, because it's very important to have the certitude, is this disease present in my country, yes or no, because it can be prevented. I come back to that in my conclusion. Second, we have a diagnostic test, which is very sensitive, not specific, but very sensitive. And if you have a context of a patient, agriculture activity, young farmer exposed to pesticides and working since many years with that, and having that lesion in the proximal cell, you have almost certainty that this is that disease. We have found that calcineurin inhibition is the most likely responsible pathway for that disease, and herbicides and insecticides have indeed calcineurin activity. So Cena is a nephropathy induced by nephrotoxic compound. The nature of this compound is yes, undetermined. Epidemiological, experimental, pathological arguments to suspect pesticides play a role in that. So to finish what we are doing now very intensively, we try to find in all those countries shown in this map, we have contacts with nephrologists, pathologists, and we try to convince them, go to your dialysis population and screen simple by interrogation. What was your job? How long you worked on the farms? Did you were exposed to pesticides? And tell us about the pesticides. And then tell us about your renal disease. Is there any glomerulonephritis, hypertension, etc., present in your history? And if it is not, you can consider these guys, this woman or this man, as a potential candidate for Cena. If you do that, like we did that in 4 countries now, you find a net percentage between 5 and 10%. You almost are sure that this disease is present. And the next step is then to go to the outpatient clinics for nephrology and to look for farmers presenting themselves with CKD 3A and 3B and to do a renal biopsy to show this renal lesion present in these patients. So by doing that, and we have made a very simple list of what kind of clinical criteria you have to look after if you want to do this interrogation for the patient. It can be done by everybody in a certain way, with a certain training. So this is our message. We have a sensitive lesion for that disease. I think the disease is much more prevalent, but it is estimated that all countries having a huge farming activity and using pesticides, which all the farmers of the whole world are doing, that this disease can be present. And if we do at a very early stage, and we can find this diagnosis at a very early stage, and the fibrosis is not very far, it's not well developed, this, the patient can be helped. And we have for that developed a protocol. We use metformin. Metformin turned out to be a very good rhinoprotector in animals and also in some simple clinical trials already, that this drug is very cheap, affordable, and can help. I just present you all the people and to know with whom we have collaborated over the years, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive lecture, and I guess a very applicable lecture for all of us here in the Philippines, because we have a lot of farmers and we have a lot of heat stress also because of the very hot climate. So we now open the floor for the question and answer. So we have two questions awaiting. So the first question, Professor, is that clinically, did these patients present with Fanconi syndrome? And
Wait.
yes. So did these patients whom you biopsied presented initially with Fanconi syndrome?
Well, it could be that you can speak of a certain type of Fanconi syndrome, because indeed it is a tubular proteinuria, which is correct.
Yes.
But in Fanconi, we have never found this lysosomal lesion. There is something wrong in the Fanconi proximal to the cell. Endocytosis is a little bit disturbed and many other things. But the specific lesion of this lysosome, we have not found in the 3 cases of Fanconi, proven Fanconi, we have biopsy.
Mm-hmm. As a follow-up to that, did the shedding of granules show any findings in the urinalysis?
A very good question. We spent already a lot of money for that was the first thing we did when we discovered all that. We started with urine of these patients, and we tried ultrasound, electron microscopy, whatever, and all the possible tests. We were for the moment not able to isolate very clearly exosomes or of whatever the tissue, but we will do it in another way now. We will now do biopsies of patients, and we will do that probably so in the Philippines. We have a good collaboration with you. We will do biopsies of patients with the disease, with a well-described use of certain pesticides, and do proteomics on serum, the biopsy, the tissue, and in the urine. And with these 3 approaches, we will find markers very specific for that disease. That's our hope. That is our next program. We have now funded, we get now funded for that, and we will now do that anyway. And in order to anticipate a little bit the question, I've shown you the last, you see this slide with all these biopsies? You see that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. This is the first results. It is absolutely unpublished, brand new, a few weeks old. We are giving to animals, rats, control rats, rats with four most used pesticides in the different countries we are collaborating with. We found them used by all of these centers having this disease. So 4 of them were given to the rats, low doses, and we saw in 2 of the 4 beautiful development, as you see in the bottom of these slides, beautiful development after 5 months in the proximal to the cell of beautiful lysosomes in the light microscope and electron microscope. In other words, we are now able to reproduce the disease in the kidney of the rats exposed to certain pesticides. 2 of them were negative and 2 of them were very positive. So we will be able to screen, when we do that in the future, more extensive type of pesticides, we will be able to identify what kind of pesticides are responsible for that disease, which of course is extremely important, because if you are vague, if you are not very concrete, very pinpointed to say these are the culprits, we will always lose the battle. But we probably will win the battle because we are now able to do that. And we have done that in rats. We are doing a biopsy after 4 months. In the same rat, we do a biopsy at 6 months, and the same rat biopsy at 9 months. So we have the progression of that lesion. And we see clearly that the first appearance is the lesion of the lysosomes as the most early effect on the kidney. So that's the new avenue we have now discovered, and we are very happy about that. But we are absolutely sure that finding a simple test in the urine will improve enormously the screening of that disease in a big population to detect very early that disease. But that will take some time.
I think we're very excited with that, with findings of other markers, because I think it's one of the limitations that we have in the Philippines is that we can't do biopsies all at once, especially among the low-income group of people, especially the farmers. They wouldn't have because it's not a subsidized medical expense to do the biopsy. So having said that, you're looking into other biomarkers for this particular disease.
Yes, but Peter, I may interrupt you. This is really, I know that. I know, of course, but this is the very case. But what we bring to the patient, if we explain, first of all, you have to convince the nephrologist. Second, the cost of the biopsy will completely be cared by us. We will do everything, all the analysis, histology analysis, in collaboration with the pathologist of it. There will be no cost. Second, the patient now, he knows that he has a disease. We have a diagnosis. And second, we will bring the metformin on the market. We will bring the metformin as an applicator and give the metformin as a protector indicator. Metformin costs less than $1 a week. You can treat the patient with the current available slow release metformin like glucophage with less than $1 a week. So we will make possibility to help them not only for the diagnosis but also for the treatment. So at that time, that ethically and also with the profit of the patient, we are in a good position to convince them and to collaborate with them.
Thank you very much for that. For the next question, is there a dose-related association with this pesticide exposure and tubular interstitial disease?
Very good question. As I said, and I have anticipated, of course, a little bit, we as I shown in the slide, which is still on the screen, is a slide from this long-term experiment we have done now in rats. And we have used 4 pesticides, which were mainly Roundup, glyphosate. And you know, Roundup is a molecule. The molecule is glyphosate, and Roundup is a combination of glyphosate and adjuvants, a lot of lipids which are combined with glyphosate in order to improve the absorption in the body and in the plant. Then we have used paraquats, and then we have used MCPA and 2,4-D. So these 4 pesticides are investigated. It's absolutely clear, and we use it a low dose, that we have to do another experiment, next experiment, where we will do a dose-dependent effect. To answer that very good question, in clinical practice, the dose relationship is overwhelming. We did together with doctors from Sri Lanka, very good collaboration, very agreeable and intellectually rewarding, and I hope we can do that in the Philippines, because I'm looking to people who want to step into certain research for that, which we will fund. So the clinical data we have developed is the rate of decrease of renal function. You look to a population in a village, and you see that the farmers, those who were the profession, in every village in Sri Lanka, in a village of 250 people, for example, you have 2 or 3 people who do the spraying every day. And the other ones who do that from time to time, but the professional sprayers, they die from renal failure in 3 years. And you're almost disappeared in this country. The farmers who use from time to time pesticide, it takes them 5 to 10 years. And the ladies and the children, as I mentioned at the beginning, were exposed to lower doses. It took them 20 years to develop end-stage renal failure. So there's a clear dose-dependent effect. We don't know, unfortunately, still what kind of pesticide, except our first results are indicating that paraquat is certainly a very serious candidate for the killing of the kidney, and also 2,4-D and MCPA. That this is a major issue, because when we will be confronted with the authorities later on, I hope in the year of 3 or 4 we will be able to go to the WHO and to the FDA and many other organizations to show them our files, and that we have to do something, that something has to ban and stop certain pesticides. And of course, you cannot live without pesticides, but you can select toxic one versus non-toxic one. And we should be able to show them a methodology, a rather simple methodology to show them that this pesticide and is potentially toxic, yes or no. These studies have never been done by the industry. So I think the answer is yes, there's a dose dependence. It's very different from one pesticide to another. And what we do in our group, what we think is a good way to look after, you can do an acute experiment with pesticides at rather high doses and see what these effect has acute renal effects. If a pesticide has very quickly an effect on the kidney at a rather high dose compared to others, that's an indicator that probably this pesticide is very toxic for the kidney. And that is, for example, the case for paraquat. If you give paraquat to the rats, there are many papers about that. There is a lot of acute renal failure effects of paraquat at several doses. So that's a way of to approach the problem. But it's still a very challenging question.
Thank you. Is there an ethnic predisposition for this Cnap?
I don't know. Very good question. We think, for the moment, we have now evidence that the Indian race, people from India and from Sri Lanka, are sensitive. The Indians from America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Paraguay, they are sensitive. There are also Indians, locals, but also, of course, black, white people and mixed people. The black race is also sensitive because the farmers in France have exactly the same lesion when they use pesticides. So I do not think that for the moment we can say we have not a single argument to think that the different types of the human race will be more sensitive or less. I don't think so.
Thank you very much, Professor. Another question, does patient present with hyperkalemia like in CNI toxicity?
Could you repeat the question?
Does patient present with hyperkalemia like in CNI?
Very good question also, very good question. We have discussed that in our paper, a recent paper we have now, and I will send to Russell. We have a recent paper in Nature Nephrology, and we will send the text to Russell. We can distribute that because it's acceptable. So we discussed that. The calcineurin inhibition, and you're right, is going along with hyperkalemia. Okay, I think the calcineurin inhibition observed in transplant patients is prominent. The doses of cyclosporin used in transplantation is 100 milligrams a day, even more in the past, but nowadays it's 100 milligrams. Tacrolimus is lower, it's 10 milligrams, a bit lower. But in the meantime, it's every day they receive a rather high dose. By inhalation, you cannot never inhalate 10 milligrams or 100 milligrams. This is impossible. The concentrations you're exposed to when you do even spreading every day, it's not 10 milligrams a day, it's much less. So the exposure to the calcineurin inhibition is different in patients with transplantation versus patients with CNAC. Second, the disease, CNAC disease, is limited to the kidney. We have not found until now, and there are papers, very good papers from Havana, where they have done a nice clinical analysis of all the different aspects of the disease, and they have to admit, and they write that the kidney is responsible for 95% of the whole spectrum of abnormalities. And in these abnormalities, there is a tubular lesion. As I said, the proximal tubular cell is suffering a lot. There's a lot of compensatory mechanisms in the distal nephron, so there is no tendency for hyperkalemia. And they have no hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia is very exceptional in CNAC. It's rather a sign of not having that disease, if I may say. The situation is completely different, but cyclosporin has a much more pronounced effect in the system, in the kidney, and also in the vessels, because first, the dose is very high. So, for example, the renin-angiotensin effects you can observe with cyclosporin. We do not see that in Cena. It's probably dose-related. I don't know. It's still a question of investigation, of course, but that's my explanation for the moment. Why we see hyperkalemia in cyclosporin and why we don't see hyperkalemia in Cena has to do, I think, with the dose, which is the effect on certain cells in proximal and distal tubular cell, which is not so prominent as, for example, with cyclosporin. If you look to cyclosporin, the endothelial cell is suffering a lot. You have the hypertrophy, and the vessels suffer a lot. We do not see that in the Cena patient. Vessel vessels in the Cena patient are not very prominent, which are very prominent in the kidneys with cyclosporin. And that's a question of exposure of dose at a certain time. That's an opinion. We still have to analyze it. The reason by the way, the reason why they have no hypertension, these patients are losing sodium. They lose magnesium. So they have tubular lesions resulting in losing certain electrolytes. They have, and that's the reason why they probably don't have hypertension.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Another question, is there any intervention to halt the disease progression of Cena?
Well, that's a very good question. Again, I will tell it in another way. I was approached 7 years ago by a French colleague and another colleague, and we did a big study on metformin use in renal failure, because metformin was not allowed. The FDA and the EMEA have prohibited the use of metformin in patients with renal failure. And there was enormous pressure from the practitioners, diabetologists, nephrologists, etc., to use that in renal failure. And there was an enormous affair to develop the development of lactic acidosis. So we did a study, and we published that in Diabetes Care in 2018, January 18, on we have given metformin to CKD 2, 3A, 3B, 4, and 5 in adapted doses according to the renal function. We give, for example, if you give 3,000 milligrams a day to a patient with renal failure, with normal renal function, we give 1,500 to 3A, 1,000 to 3B, and 500 for 4. That's it. And by doing that, you don't go into accumulation of metformin. You do not observe lactic acidosis. The lactate remains very stable, etc. So that was for me a discovery of metformin. And then I started reading, and I found two or three very good papers, the American group and also an European one, showing that metformin was very renal protective in animals, in rats, in different models of renal failure. The renal kidney model, obstructive model, the ischemic model, etc. Amazing, very protective of the kidney. And then I found, and that was the last argument which was launching in myself, the willingness of doing that, was a nice study of pharmacists in the United States. They looked in a retrospective way to 45,000 transplanted patients, of whom 20% had received metformin and the rest no, not metformin. So huge numbers, simple study, a lot of bias, but the result is unbelievable. You see that metformin, those who have received metformin, be it cadaver donors or living donors, the survival rate of the graft is dramatically different. An improvement of 45% survival in the graft rate over 5 years. So that was a retrospective study. It's a very strong argument to start a prospective one. And this is what we do now. We have now in Belgium in 19 centers. We do 380 patients randomized to placebo versus metformin, CKD 3A and 3B. And we will have results in 2 years. So I think that is for me a wonderful step forward in the protection of the destruction of the renal of the kidney by a process like Cena and many other processes. And it is also a cheap drug. and it is absolutely non-toxic, a non-toxic drug. We have now experienced hundreds and hundreds of patients with CKD who have received metformin in adapted doses. They do not develop lactic acidosis. Even more, if you have lactic acidosis and you are under metformin, your survival is much better when you have if you are under metformin compared to someone who is not. So one can reasonably defend that this drug has an enormous experience on its safety. We know exactly what this drug is doing concerning safety. We know more and more about the mechanism. It is probably through the AMPK, stimulation of the AMPK in the proximal tubular cells, that this drug is working. So for Cena, it's a wonderful application. So I think we will do that. If Philippines are playing the game with us, we will invite them to step into that protocols to do that and to protect their patients, their kidneys, by using metformin.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Among those patients who were given metformin, were there incidences of hypoglycemia if they were given like 3 times the dosing?
Good question. Good question. When you look to the literature, I'm not a diabetologist, so I have to learn my things. I'm good friends, etc., but I'm not a diabetologist. But I learned a lot about this hypoglycemia. It is, a diabetologist told me that metformin is considered as the only anti-diabetic drug which never gives hypoglycemia. And if you look to the literature, I was challenged dramatically when I proposed my protocol to the jury 3 years ago, metformin in CKD. You will say, oh, you will see, you will have accumulation, you will have lactic acidosis, there will be hypoglycemia, etc., etc. I did the literature. There are some case reports which are writing indeed that in a particular patient they have observed from time to time hypoglycemia. Okay, it's not little and very exceptional. And a lot of those case reports, like many of the case reports, it's always very difficult to be absolutely sure that what is written down is correct and has been submitted to the necessary control, because case reports most of the time are retrospective. It's very difficult to do correct diagnosis out of case reports. So hypoglycemia under metformin is very exceptional, provided you use the appropriate doses with the renal failure of a certain patient. And to repeat, never give more than 1,500 to CKD 3A, never more than 1,000 to CKD 3B, never more than 500 to 4, and do not use metformin in CKD 5 for the moment in dialysis, because the studies are not appropriate and not that. So that's what I think is the guideline.
Thank you very much, Professor. Another question, I think this has been answered already. Is there any particular type of agricultural product that is nephrotoxic to the kidney? I guess you mentioned we don't have many studies that specifies which agricultural product is more nephrotoxic.
I have not captured everything. Could you repeat?
The question is there any particular type of agricultural product that is nephrotoxic to the kidney?
What kind of product? That's a very good question, of course. It's a key question. Of course, it's a key question. As I said, we spend a lot of time and we have that information. I will do that with my Philippine colleagues. We will start by collecting data published many times. You have a very good information in countries on the use of pesticides on the market. I found that, for example, in Morocco, it's excellent. In Egypt, even in Egypt, which is not a very economically strong country, they have done excellent reports on the use and abuse of herbicides. And I'm quite sure that in the Philippines it will be available. Second, we will do interviews and professional interviews looking for what kind of pesticide is used, under what conditions, how long, did you use mixtures, etc., etc. We have a questionnaire which takes 20 minutes before you have to go over that, and then you have a good idea what kind of pesticide did this man, this woman, mostly the man, of course, still the farmers are still more males than females, is that we have an idea of the exposure. And it comes out of all that and that's interesting too, that the 9 countries of which we have that information, we made an overview of that, and we put a hit parade list of the 10 most used pesticides in the world. And that's the first list we are now using to give to animals and to see if we can reproduce the lesion, the lysosomal lesion, in the kidneys of those animals, and showing that this particular pesticide is certainly very nephrotoxic. On the other hand, some others are less. And for example, as I said already, glyphosate, which is probably not, certainly not so nephrotoxic as, for example, paraquat. And we have, before I cannot say anything more, because our analysis will be finished in September. And then we will have an overview over 9 months and 3 different biopsies of the different pesticides to see what kind of lesions a particular pesticide is inducing. The problem with Roundup is that the molecule, which is glyphosate, is probably a not very toxic molecule, but it is associated with surfactants and with adjuvants. And we do not know, and these are a very big mixture of many carbohydrates and many other molecules, which are potentially increasing the toxicity of the herbicides. But that's a file completely separate. We will go into very strong detail of that, because glyphosate is the most used pesticide. Roundup is the most used pesticide in the world, still, for the moment.
Thank you very much, Professor. For the next question, are these biopsy findings similar to the biopsy findings in series of patients reported in men, Mesoamerica nephropathy? Is it related, or is it considered as distinct from men?
So you ask me if the biopsy is...
Findings, yes. Is it
biopsies of... Sorry?
The Cnap biopsies that you presented, is this similar to Mesoamerica nephropathy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm happy that is asked. There is a lot of confusion in the literature. People have tried to make the name of that disease. We have named it Cena, chronic interstitial nephritis of agricultural communities. It could be that this name will not be accepted, or we have to change that. But for us, it covers at best it can the definition of that disease. But there is a group, a Swedish group, and also Rick Johnson from the United States, which is always speaking about the Mesoamerica nephropathy. But what I have to say, we have found in as well as Nicaragua, El Salvador, Sri Lanka, India, and France, and Morocco, the lesion is exactly the same. So what? It's very difficult to speak about Mesoamerica nephropathy and telling that is a different nephropathy. I don't believe that. The only thing which could be a difference, but the histology, there is one lady who did the study, the lady from Karolinska Institute, Sylvia Wikström is her name, Susan Wikström. She published 2 papers, one paper biopsy in Sri Lanka and one paper of 15 patients in El Salvador and in Nicaragua. And she has to admit that there is no clear difference to see between these 2 different groups of patients. The only difference which is probably there is that the dehydration and the heat stress is more pronounced in El Salvador and Nicaragua compared to Sri Lanka. The crops in the Mesoamerican region is sugarcane. In Sri Lanka, it's not. It's tea plantations, it's paddy fields, where the exposure to heat stress is less because the people sit on tractors covered by a shield, and they wear all hats, and they sit down. By cutting sugarcane is a very laborious, a very exhaustive job of poor people who have to do that. So it could be that the dehydration is much more pronounced in El Salvador patients compared to patients in Sri Lanka. And that dehydration may be a contributive factor to the progression of the renal failure. I'm not discussing that. I really consider that as a possibility. And we will do the experiment, combination of experiments of dehydration plus the culprits we found. We will find with paraquat, we will do that, and with MCPA, and we will do that without dehydration and with dehydration to see if the dehydration is on top of the nephrotoxicity of the pesticides, a contributing factor to the progression of the renal failure. And I should not be surprised that this is indeed the case.
Thank you very much. For our last question, if Cena has a similar phenotype with CNI nephrotoxicity, did you also find other findings such as chronic effects of renal vasoconstriction in the biopsy of these patients?
Yeah, so that's why I think for the moment we will do that. We have to do that, by the way. More accurate, we have done a lot of morphometry already on the lysosomes. We know this, we know the measure, and we know the size, etc. We all know, we know that. The vessels we have approached in a qualitative way with the professor of pathology of Los Angeles, which is C. Janast, very good pathologist. And I hope again and express my interest in the pathologies of your country, because this can be a very good collaboration. We have to do that. What is the part of the vessels? We think for the moment that is very marginal. And we have never found in a superficial analysis a very pronounced presence of vascular lesions in the Cnap patients. One of the major reasons we probably have no major vascular lesions is that these patients have no hypertension. If you have no hypertension, of course, we explain that due to the sodium loss, but if you have vascular lesions, most of the time you have hypertension, that everybody is well aware of. Patients with renal disease and hypertension have vascular lesions. So, but we have to do it in a better way, and I'm aware of that, and we will do that. And we have the opportunity now, and that will be enormously interesting for our insight in that mechanism. One of our collaborators is Dr. Yamasumana from Sri Lanka. He's a very good doctor. Very liked, people like him because he's doing a lot for the farmers. He has planned this, he's finished trial, by the way, a study in young people between 18 and 25 years of age in endemic areas and non-endemic areas. And we have collected urine 3 times over 1 year, so 3 samples in the endemic and non-endemic. And we will see if the patients, the endemic and the non-endemic, have 3 times abnormalities in the urine. We will do a renal biopsy to see what is the early phase of that disease. And that will learn us a lot. That will learn us a lot, I think will be, because the difficulty always is, and the pathologists know that very well, of course, if you see a patient, he is sick since many years, and he comes to your consultation, he has CKD3B. You do a biopsy. You find a lot of fibrosis, sometimes not, sometimes yes. It's very difficult to make the natural course of the disease in a patient you see for the first time after many years. So the best way to do is to collect data systematically, well done, in a collaborative way in several centers in the world, to see what is the early stage of that disease. Can be at what time can we already start treatment, for example? Is it necessary to start people at a young age when they present some abnormalities in the urine and maybe some lysosomal lesions in the biopsy? Yes or no? So that question is still not answered.
Thank you very much. There are more questions. What are the extrarenal manifestations in Cnap?
Good question. Yeah, good question. We have just looked at the literature and looked a little bit to the patient, because we have never, I am working in Antwerp and we go, of course, many times to those places at Sri Lanka, but no, unfortunately no more since the coronavirus catastrophe. But the people from Havana, and I will send all the papers to that when I elaborate collaboration with you. So the people from Havana have done very good clinical observation, because the doctors in Havana are very good clinicians. They don't have many facilities, but they are very well trained in epidemiology, prevention, and in clinical observations. They have very in-depth analysis of whatever extrarenal manifestation. The only thing they found, and I cannot explain it, is in the lower limbs there seems to be arterial lesions to be present in some of the patients. That's all what they found. They have not found anything on the brain, they have not found in the lungs, they have not found in the liver. even not in the uric acid, because uric acid is not, it's very exceptional that uric acid is increased in these patients. But they found something on the, and this Dr. Herrera, those who want to see literature, his name is Raul Herrera, H-E-R-A-R-A, Herrera, Raul Herrera, who published that and did a very extensive analysis of all the extrarenal manifestations. But the number of manifestations are very limited and not very, very pronounced.
Okay. Thank you very much. Another question, how can these findings influence WHO and policymakers to curb the increasing incidence of Cnap? I think this is a very relevant question.
Another good question. And the audience is very intelligent, apparently, in the Philippines. Thank you very much for that. So that was the goal. That's my major goal, to achieve that goal together with a lot of people with whom we were collaborating and with whom we will collaborate. Because we have to come all together out of these, if we can do all that, prove in 20 countries that lesion is present. And we can do that. We'll have 10 countries next year altogether. So it's not difficult to add more countries. For example, Thailand, Cambodia, the situation is unbelievable. The number of patients who die there from renal failure in the street, in the area of Chiang Mai, in the area from Preah Vihear in Cambodia, and many other countries. It's a question of finding the fit with the number of nephrologists, intelligent, hardworking, and motivated for doing that we can collect data. We will not make a lot of noise. I'm invited almost every month to go to the newspapers and television, etc. I always refuse. I will refuse until we are absolutely sure what we are saying. What will meaning that as long as we do not, first of all, we think we have the step now set, this disease is primarily a toxic nephropathy. That's correct. The heat stress maybe is a contributing factor, still to be proven, but I think it's worthwhile to investigate that. But the first thing is, it is a toxic nephropathy, but we do not know what kind of herbicides are in concern. We're starting discovering steadily some of them, but there are many others who have to be done in the different countries and in different places in the world. Once we have that, and when that we can also describe the natural cause of the disease, that doing renal biopsies at different time periods, to do the good analysis, is this lysosomal lesion the reason for the renal suffering? It could be an epiphenomenon, on I don't know what, but I think what give us a lot of confidence in our idea is the finding that in the rats and in the humans, in the biopsies of the transplant patients, starting without any lesion in the proximal cell, 3 months later, all of them have. The first lesion is this lysosomal lesion in the proximal cell, in the absence of a lot of fibrosis and a lot of atrophy. So that's probably the sign that this lysosomal lesion is maybe a precursor of the lethal lesion, but we have to prove that still. And we will now have in September, October, the first information in this rat study, where we have 3 biopsies done in the same rat. They all survived, except 1 out of 85. There are several biopsies, that the natural cause of the disease. And then, when we all have that information, the correct information on the sequence of events, the pathway, the correct pathway, the kind of herbicide, pesticides involved in that process, then we can go to the authorities and say that, and we will do that all together with all those we have helped us in coming and achieve this information. And before that, we have not to do that because there has been so much noise about paraquat, about Roundup, etc., etc. And most of this information was not very good, was weak, was not proven. There's not a single case. There's no reason to think when you have a patient in the United States who has developed, who have used Roundup during 20 years, and he develops an Hodgkin disease. That this Hodgkin disease is due to this Roundup. Association is not causation. So we have to forget all that. And we will never win the battle if we go on like that on case report level and media, etc., etc. hard science, good science, clinical, basic, and epidemiological ones. There's the only one. And then it will take some time to convince the politicians. But they will follow us if we have good data.
That very important question and intelligent question came from Dr. Lynn Gomez. So I guess you have your first volunteer in all your interviews, Professor.
Thank you. Nice to hear that.
I think this is the last question from Dr. Leiritana. Does Cnap affect only farmers and their families exposed to these pesticides? How about people eating this produce?
Very good question again. There is we have not done until now this to approach that question, but it's a good one. There is in the heat stress population, the heat stress papers, a lot of authors describe cases of heat stress not only in the farmers but also in other patients. But the evidence, again, as I said a few minutes ago, the evidence of that is very weak. If you do that and you say that the patient has an heat stress nephropathy and you have no biopsy, so what? What are you doing? It's not because a patient has an increase of his serum creatinine, which can be very short time. You have to do that for a long time. You have to follow that patient. You have to repeat that. All that has not been done. So as long as all these things are not been done, you cannot argue that heat stress is a cause of hemophilia. In our condition, we have not found anything now, except in some toxic nephropathies, as I have explained. We have patients who had with cancer drugs who have developed this lesion. We had lithium, but as I explained, all these drugs we have found until now have a certain calcineurin inhibition effect. We have nephrotoxic nephropathies who have not this lysosomal lesion. For example, the Chinese herb nephropathy, which is due to aristolactic acid, do not develop this lysosomal lesions. Tenofovir, which is a very powerful drug in HIV, and which is a very nephrotoxic drug, is not developing that lesion. And so on. So I have several conditions where we have seen that this nephrotoxic lesion is not necessarily related to lysosomal lesions. So the main problem for all that is to do correct studies, and just to come back to the more essential things, we have found also, we will do also in our biopsy studies, because I think what happens, paraquat, for example, and MCPA, I found some literature, and we collaborate now with a girl from Italy, a lady from Italy. She is a very good pharmacologist, and she knows about the renal pharmacology. She clearly has shown that paraquat enters the cell from the basolateral side, stay in the cell, and is not very well transported out of the cell. And as we know, there are always different transporters at the basolateral side, which are OCT1, OCT2, organic cations, etc. And on the other side, you have other transporters, and they play their own role. And as long as you have a balance between these two, what comes in and what comes out is in balance, you will not develop nephrotoxicity. But when you have an imbalance, like for paraquat and maybe others, and we will do that now, and we do that in cell culture. You can use human cells from a renal biopsy from a patient. We use for that the patients who have surgery for renal cancer. You go to the theater, operation theater, and you take the normal part of the kidney, the rest, of course, for pathological analysis, and then we use that, and we use these fresh cultures, because it's very important to use fresh cultures in human cells, and we have a system where you can administer the drug at the top of the cell, the apical form, or you can give the drug at the basolateral form, because the culture is tight, it's closed. So you can study transport in one direction and the other direction. And this will help us also in understanding the way why this is toxic and why there is toxicity. Most challenging one will be, is the lysosomal lesion a precursor, and is that related to cell death and cell atrophy, which will not be an easy question.
very much, Professor. So I guess it's the end of the question and answer portion. So in behalf of the Philippine Society of Nephrology, we would like to thank Professor Mark Debro for enlightening us on this topic. And I guess we will be looking forward to research collaborations, which we feel will also be very beneficial to our local farmers. So again, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, we
Please.
hope to welcome you in person in the
Thank you.
Philippines.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. So to all our participants, thank you very much, and we hope that you can join us again next week on our PSN webinar entitled "A Practical Approach to Sodium and Water Disorders: Too Little or Too Much" by Dr. June Anacleto will be our speaker for that. So again, thank you very much, and good evening to everyone.